I mentioned my name is Siobhan LVL, and I'm with the Asylum and Immigration Law Clinic, and I'm happy to welcome you here today to the event, Case Study of a Refugee. It's one in a series of events that have taken place around Chicago, focused on a dialogue around law, humanitarian issues, and war. We're grateful today for the sponsorship of the International Human Rights Law Institute, and Carrie Campbell will be giving us some background, some context for our focused discussion on Iraqi refugees and Iraqi refugee resettlement process. The International Human Rights Law Institute here at DePaul was instrumental in developing today's panel. They're approached by the American Red Cross for setting up today's panel in this series of lectures and have really worked thoughtfully to think about how to present these issues to you today. And then I know they were assisted by DePaul's Society for Asylum and Immigration Law and Alex Strunk, who's a student in the law clinic who I know has contributed to working on the panel and roped me into giving the welcome here today. Now, it wasn't roped. I'm happy to be here. The panel is also sponsored by the American Red Cross of Greater Chicago and the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we're also grateful for the partnership of Northeastern Illinois University and also Loyola University. So a lot of hands went into the work here today, which is good because you're going to get a lot of perspective. Certainly one significant event that's the consequence of conflict is the displacement of persons from their homes, from their communities, from their families, from their culture, from their language, from their employment, from all of those things that contribute to one's identity, to one's sense of self-worth, self-esteem, and dignity. And today's lecture provides insight into the immediate and real consequences of conflict, of that displacement for individuals who are forced to flee from the places that they were born, from the places that they had homes, from the places that they had families, and the challenges presented by resettlement into a new community, into a new place, into a new life. In the Asylum and Immigration Law Clinic, students that I work with have the opportunity to witness some of these issues in a real and immediate sense. In recent years, students working with me have represented a young man, you might even call him a boy, who was 16 years old when he came to us, seeking asylum in the United States. He had fled Somalia, and I think what's still remarkable to me, even though I've done this work for a really long time, is that from the time that he was born, he had experienced nothing other than violence and conflict. He was born in 1991 and had never experienced a homeland with the central government or central authority, and even told us that I have only seen violence in my life. And that's still something that resonates with me, even though I do this work every day, even though I represent asylum seekers every day. His story also exposed students to the issues of conflict and to the consequences of conflict, but he himself was shot at. His house was bombed. When his house was bombed, his brother was killed. His father fled the home after militia ran into the home and opened fire into the home. And eventually, he, his mother, and his surviving siblings left Mogadishu to Afgoye, to a makeshift settlement camp there. And his mother urged him, in part, I think, because of fear that he would be recruited by militia and be forced to be involved in the conflict himself, to find safety. So he came to the United States on his own. Since he left Somalia in 2007, he's never seen or spoken to his mother. He's never seen or spoken to his siblings. He doesn't know where they are, and he doesn't know whether or not they'll ever see him again. And in terms of talking to him about potential remedies that he might have in the future, the students had to talk to him about how he might be able to legally see his mother and his siblings again. And that was, a sad and painful discussion because it will be years, if at all, before, over a decade before he will be able to see them again legally here in the United States. Students also recently represented a man from Eritrea who fled to the United States after he was tortured on account of his religious beliefs in Eritrea. He was granted asylum. When he left, He left his wife and 2 children behind. His children were born in 2001 and 2004. His children still remain outside of the United States, and he remains here in the United States, and his children have turned, 7, 8, and 9 while he's been separated from them. And I have several clients like that who tell me about their children, their young children, that they've been forced to leave behind, and how the memories of their parents have faded during the course of separation. Students also see in a real way the limitations of the adjustment and resettlement process here in the United States. They've seen plenty of clients who held positions of prestige in their own communities, and now, notwithstanding the amount of accomplishments, education, experience in their home country, are not in that same position here in the United States. They're looking at entry-level positions and the dramatic decrease in wages and circumstance in the United States. We're lucky today to have a wonderful group of experts to speak to us in more detailed ways about some of the topics that I've mentioned here today. I mentioned Carrie Camel will provide us with an introduction into the conflict in Iraq. It's going to be a brief introduction. And you'll also hear from Greg Wangren with the Interfaith Refugee and Immigration Ministries, and Dr. Ed Silverman, who is the Refugee Coordinator for Illinois Department of Human Services. There are few people, certainly in the city, certainly in the state, in the country, with the extent of expertise that Dr. Silverman and Mr. Wangren bring to bear on the issues. They've been working in this area for decades and have witnessed many different groups of refugees come into the United States, have witnessed the refugee resettlement process here in the United States, but are also very aware of the causes and bring a wealth of expertise. You'll hear the personal story of Alpan Muhammad, who is herself an Iraqi refugee, who's been a humanitarian worker both abroad and here in the United States, and brings unique perspective. And I challenge all of you, I don't know her personally, but I've read a little bit about her story, and I challenge all of you not to be moved by it today. We'll also hear from refugee resettlement agencies specifically working with Iraqi refugees here in the United States. And finally, we'll hear from the American Red Cross about a family tracing project they have. I mentioned earlier our client, the young man from Somalia, who doesn't know where his parents are, doesn't know where his siblings are. And this project that the American Red Cross is in charge of works to try and trace family members who've been separated as a result of conflict and war. So it's going to be a great program. You're going to learn a lot, take notes, and I'll turn it over to Carrie Camel. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me in the back? I'd like to welcome you today on behalf of the International Human Rights Law Institute and all of our co-sponsors. This is a unique event for us in that we typically don't do refugee events. Our work is mostly overseas, and we actually began our work in Iraq in 2003, and we currently have 6 offices in Iraq. So for us, it's sort of an interesting experience to see the work that we do overseas and see how the situation is actually beginning to affect us locally here in Chicago. So without further ado, I will attempt to give a very brief background of the conflict and what's created the current refugee situation, in hopes that I will give a backdrop for our very distinguished speakers that we will be having later on. Currently, there are over 5 million displaced Iraqis. Half of the Iraqi refugees are located in Syria and Jordan, as well as other neighboring countries. Half of them are internally displaced in Iraq. The current displacement figure is around 5.4 million. It's thought that approximately 1/3 of the refugees fled generalized violence, while about 2/3 of them fled from targeted religious, political, or ethnic persecution, and in many cases were forced to leave their property. For those of you who aren't lawyers, you may not be interested in the legal definition, but the legal definition of a refugee is found in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, and I'll read that briefly. A refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. That is relevant because countries that are parties to this convention usually have implementing legislation. Countries that are not party to this do not. So the U.S. has its own tailored definition. This is relevant because many of the refugees that are going to, for example, Jordan and Syria have different local legislation. Why are there so many Iraqi refugees? The current flow of refugees started, let's go back to the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988. The country was obviously in the middle of a war. Since 1991, Iraq has been under sanctions, and then after that, the U.S. invaded Iraq on March 19, 2003. 21 days into the war, Saddam Hussein's regime fell. The country was devastated, both in economic and humanitarian terms, first by the first Gulf War, then the sanctions, and then by the current war. In May of 2003, former President Bush remarked that the mission was accomplished. However, several years later, we still have over 5 million displaced, and anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million are dead, depending on which mortality study you can look at. And when you leave outside, one of our fellows here at the Institute actually prepared a comparative study of mortality data in Iraq, so you may be interested to look at that. So, the countries hosting the largest number of refugees, which I mentioned before, Syria, Jordan, and so on, are not signatories to the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. What does this mean? The refugees usually reside there illegally, or they are there officially only as visitors, so they cannot obtain work authorization, and many refugees lack legal residency rights. In the past 2 years, many of the refugees that are there have exhausted their savings, and the cost of living in these host countries, particularly in Jordan, has rapidly risen. This is causing individuals who are initially from the upper and middle classes to descend into poverty, and their children are allowed only limited access to health care and education. Of those still living inside Iraq, an estimated 8 million civilians are in need of urgent assistance. 4 million still have food insecurity, and 2.7 million are internally displaced, meaning they're still in the country, but they're not living in their own homes or communities. Over 60% of the internally displaced are from Baghdad. In Jordan, Jordan has taken in around 500,000 Iraqi refugees. Because of this, Jordan has received international funding for the education of Iraqi students. A very small percentage of Iraqi students go to school. This is because families cannot afford to transport them, or the children are working illegally in order to support the family, or the parents are simply afraid for the safety of their children. In Jordan, refugees have no legal status, and it's been reported that it can cost up to $100,000 US in some cases to attain a residency pass. Jordan has been condemned for recognizing Iraqis simply as visitors and not extending the same rights received by other refugees. In Syria, the other country that has the most Iraqi refugees, has accommodated approximately 1.5 million of them. 55% of the Iraqi men in Syria are unemployed, and over 1/3 of Iraqi families there do not even have a male member of a household. This leaves them particularly vulnerable. And as most of you may know, Syria is considered a rogue nation by the U.S., so there is little international help offered to Syria to help accommodate their Iraqi refugee situation. In October 2007, 2 years ago, the Syrian government imposed stricter visa requirements for the refugees. In Damascus, Iraqi refugees try to earn a living in the markets and the streets selling things there. A brief impact of the war and occupation on Iraq. I had mentioned before about the casualties. Again, I direct you to those reports. The estimates vary widely, and you can see the methodology of the different reports and why they came up with different numbers. However, we do know that people have been targeted for killings, particularly professionals. Doctors and medical personnel have been killed in the thousands. Judges and judicial workers have been killed in the hundreds, and academics also have been killed in the hundreds. The impact of war on Iraqi youth. The Iraqi educational system was one of the best in the developing world and perhaps one of the best in the Middle East between the years 1973 and 1991. They had the highest literacy rates among fellow Arab countries, and until 1991, education was mandatory for all children. Both men and women could attend from elementary school to grad school at no cost whatsoever. But after the first Gulf War and the sanctions and the current war and occupation, there's been devastating impact on the educational system. In addition, the severe poverty that Iraqis now face has been driving Iraq's young men into militias out of desperation in order to feed their families. The militias buy the youth and their families' loyalty by providing basic needs such as medicine, food, and other necessities. The most vulnerable groups, as in most situations, are the women and children. And the women and children make up the largest percentage of displaced Iraqis, and they are the most vulnerable to deteriorating conditions, particularly as they are forbidden to work in their communities without work visas, and there is also social scrutiny if they do. And one particularly devastating fact is that thousands of women have actually turned to prostitution as an economic means to survival. A few more statistics, and I only go through these because they're particularly shocking and depressing when you read through them. But from 1990 to 2005, infant mortality rates increased 150%. In 2005 alone, over 120,000 Iraqi children died before reaching the age of 5. In 2009, child malnutrition stands at a staggering 22%. And an unbelievably large number, over 70% of Iraqi children, suffer from some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as women and the men who have been through this. And on another note, our Health Law Institute here ran a couple of articles regarding mental and physical health in Iraq, and you can also find that outside. Psychological impacts of the war and occupation. According to a UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees offices in Amman, Jordan, they conducted an interview with registered Iraqis there. 80% reported being witness to a shooting. 68% reported interrogation or harassment by militias. 77% reported being affected by shelling or rocket attacks. 72% reported being witness to car bombings. 23% of Iraqis in Baghdad have had a family member kidnapped. 75% have had a family member murdered. And 80,000 Iraqis needed artificial limbs. And these are just statistics of the Iraqis that are in Jordan. Additionally, there is another group, another subsect within this of Iraqis that are at risk. Because of the U.S. invasion and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime, many Iraqis thought this would bring about a positive change in their country, so many thousands of them actually aided the U.S. military in some way. It's estimated that over 120,000 Iraqis and their families assisted the U.S. in some capacity. These Iraqis have often been branded as traitors by many and had received death threats or been killed. This community, like many other vulnerable refugee communities, is still at risk and should be resettled. However, they represent about 5% of the total Iraqi refugee population. The U.S. has now increased the number of Iraqi refugees allowed to resettle in the U.S., and I think you gentlemen can maybe go into further detail on that. In 2008, 12,000 were resettled in the U.S., and the goal for 2009, I believe, was about 17,000. However, this pales in comparison to the numbers that we see in Jordan, 500,000 and 1.5 million admitted in Syria. The two programs I would like to bring to your attention about the U.S. legal framework. One is the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, otherwise known as USRAP, and that's available to Iraqis who have worked for the U.S. government, government contractors, or U.S.-based media organizations, NGOs, and their family members. And that is one way that they can get refugee resettlement in the U.S. And the other one is a special immigrant visa for Iraqis, which does not give them refugee status, but gives them the same benefits that refugees receive. So they receive resettlement assistance and the other programs. And with that, that was a nice, quick, brief overview. If you have any other further questions, I'm sure our distinguished panelists can answer them in more detail. But I would like to introduce our next speaker, and that is Ms. Ahlam Mahmoud, an actual friend of mine. I met her when she first came to the U.S. last year, and I'm proud to have her here with us. She has spoken at the Institute several times, and an amazing woman to know. So without further ado, Ahlam. Can you do this? I'm just going to leave this here for you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ahlam Mahmoud. I'm from Iraq, 44 years, married with 2 children. My story is not a personal one. It's something happened every day something happened every day to much of the Iraqis who have the opportunity and get resettled. They've been relieved from a big pain. Who's not been lucky? They stuck as a refugee between the borders or somewhere in the Arab country that neighbors to Iraq. I live in Baghdad. I'm grown up there in one of the farms outside the city in the countryside. Before 2003, I was working as a fixer and translator for the journalist. We don't know anything about the NGOs in Iraq before 2003. 2003, the war began. Unfortunately, the invasion began from my district, where much of the military and the civilians was living there. We was stuck in the middle of nowhere, nobody helped, nobody there even to do anything for the injured people. We make a team, me and my cousins. We was concerned about the dead people because we recognize that nobody will come and take them or bury them or do anything for them, and nobody know for how long it will take them. So we make like a team. We dress a white shirts and white flags in a way not to make the American military attacking us. And we took the description of the people who's dead or killed in the street anywhere and registered them in a registration book. After we took every kind of description, if we have their ID or anything else, then we mark the graves and we put the same mark on our registration book. We didn't give it to anybody because we are not secure. Nobody knows what will going on in the second moment. So we put it in the mosque. If anything happened to us, the people who are coming to the mosque, they will find it and they can deal with it. They can tell the people afterward what's going on with this registration book. From that moment, my life's been changed. I left the journalism world forever, and I tried to get help. I was asking for help from anybody. I don't care who. I don't care who is it. I care about getting help to these people. And I was struggled because there is a lot of opportunity, but there is no information. You cannot deal with it, official things, and you can go to it. We have no government. I want to focus on this issue. We are not having just a war and bombing and this is it. No. The war, the invasion in 2003, there is no government for a whole year. A country without government, without any kind of system, without any kind of information for anything. The looting and the violence that happened in 2 months, they make all the hospitals unqualified to receive any kind of injuries. I still remember when we was kicking the doors, our cousins and family members' doors, and collect the medicine from their homes in a way to make some first aid for the injured people. Afterward, I cannot handle with my small team. We are just 5 people. So I was calling the military. I told them, we have a lot of cases, injuries, and we have a lot of people who are sick, and we don't have the ability to take them anywhere. They support us for a little bit time. Then the violence began, stopped everything. We can't say that we have anything this time. This moment make another challenge, a bigger one, is to looking for any kind of assistance outside the American forces. I went and make my, I registered as employee on the Iraqi Assistance Center and try to find any agency or organization that we've heard about them, but we didn't saw them in the field down there, who want to help the Iraqis. And I have no opportunity to meet anybody if I am not employee in anything. I have no official name. So I became in Academia district responsible about a humanitarian organization down there. In 3 months, they appointed me as a city council member for Academia district. And I continue my work in the 2 fields in one time. In the end of 2004, there is a lot of threatened against me, written, one letters, direct threatened. I wasn't care in the beginning. But when it's become close to my children, I decided to take them to Syria. I took them to Syria, I make them resettled down there, and I returned back to Iraq to continue my job. For 5 months, for a health case, I have to be into one of the hospitals. When I get out from the hospitals, after 7 days, I've been kidnapped for 8 days. The kidnappers, of course, I'm dealing with the American forces, so I'm an interpreter for the military. As normal, you cannot say yes or no in the street because you are in the military as interpreter. I've been released after 8 days with 2 conditions. One of them is paying ransom as a $50,000. And the second thing, I have to leave my country. So I took my children, went to Jordan. They not welcoming us. Go to Egypt. It's terrible down there. So we returned back to Syria. We settled down there with my children, trying to register them by the schools. The schools is overloaded with the students. You cannot imagine 40 students in one classroom for 2 shifts, in the morning, in the afternoon shifts, because the facilities is so limited. And the Syrians and the Iraqis, both of them, they went to the same school. So it's a very terrible situation down there for the student. In 2006, I lost my oldest son because of wrong injection. The health system there is so bad. And if you are a refugee and you are not able to pay for anything for the private services, then you can take it. And I take it. I lost my son by it. In 2006, I began to work with the UNHCR and with the UNICEF, located the people who are in deep need, trying to get them some services, and try my best to do something for them, help to recognize the people who's in need and the families who's in need. I submit my paperwork to become a refugee and have a resettlement in any country that accepts us, because down there you are not having the right to choose. They will choose the country for you, choose even the city for you. In May 2008, I've been arrested by the Syrian intelligence. They want me to cooperate with them, and I refused, so they take me from my home. For 5 months, I have no idea about my children, where they are or where they have been. All what I know, I've been put under the ground with 2 floors. After 5 months, I've been released with the help from a friend who was concerned about my situation, and Amnesty International, who was very helpful in this matter, because I was helping them to do their yearly report about the Iraqi refugee in Syria. I get released at 7 o'clock. I meet my children at 9 o'clock. I was in the airport at 10:30. Honestly, this is what's going on. Until now, if I want to remember it, I will never. How can I be reasonable and have my mind till now? Thank God for that. 4:30, I was in the airplane. Go toward Budapest. I have nothing. The same dress I be released with it from the jail, I reached state with. This is all what I have. We reached Budapest, from Budapest to New York, and then everyone been sent to some of the city or the states. And I'm the only one who's standing in the middle. I'm terrified. My children was terrified too. They don't know what's happening to them in 2 seconds. And I'm the mother. I'm the one who will have to have more reasonable. So I asked them where I will be resettled. They told me Chicago. I asked the man down there, is it a state or a city? So he told me, you don't know the differences between a state and a city? No, I know, but is Chicago, is it a state or a city? He said, it's a city. Thank you very much, sir. This is all the information I have. The thing that is still in my mind, when I get released from the intelligence jail, and I took to the UNHCR offices and gathered with my children. In the UNHCR, there is a woman She told me, if you have somebody, feel merciful for your situation here. Instead, you will find nobody. I believe her because she's an international caseworker. She's not a local one. And this is my situation here. I reached Chicago at 9 o'clock in the morning, went to the offices, signed a paper. I have no idea about them, of course. Then I go to my apartment, and this is the moment I was really terrified. This is the reality. You are here, you are in an apartment with your children, nothing else. I have no information. I have nobody with me. I don't know anybody. Totally nobody. My children refused to go to sleep. I took them to the internet cafe and waited just to contact somebody and told them, okay, I reached United States, I'm safety with my children. I find one. I took just one phone number and contact somebody. This somebody talked to the others who is here, and in the first night, I have Iraqi refugee knock on my door and welcome here in Chicago. Okay, thank you. I can't forget the first person I met here. I'm lucky to have him here in this room. Father Tom, the father of the Iraqis. I went to him after 3 days. I asked for clothes because we have no idea about Chicago weather. Yeah, I arrived in the beginning of winter. I have no food. I have no idea about markets. Where can I buy things? And I still remember him. Calm down. You will be okay. You need just a little bit of time, and you will be okay. He makes me comfortable. After I supply my house, there is a friend came in from Canada to visit, and New York to visit. Then Amnesty International sent me my best friend, Beth Ann Ethiopian. She's here with us. And from this moment, she's with me. Lead me to the way whenever I have even a small letter, help, because I'm not familiar with the words here. If I have any kind of knowledge, okay, even if I know it, I misunderstand it. So she always with me. We started our work here to help the Iraqi refugee. After we figure out what's going on with them here, I'm just a sample, and this is what I have. I have a lot of families that I already know from Syria. They have their own dreams, but when they came here, they stuck with the reality. The reality, unfortunately, is not helpful for them, not a bit, not a little bit. They came here for 8 months. They will have supportment, and the 8 months, have to make them qualified in English, and then they get a job. If the condition of the economy situation is so bad, how can they get a job? If the youngs who between 18 and up, they was dreaming about attending schools and finishing their education. In Iraq, the thing that makes the person so respectable, it's what degree he had. It's not about his wealth. What about his degree? What about his education? This is what is meaning respectable for the Iraqis. This is the main aim for their life. When the mother saw their children cannot adjust to the schools, they can't deal with the street. Till now, I'm still worried about my children. I have not to be away from apartment after 4 o'clock because they have no street intelligence to make them deal with the street things. I can't allow them to go by themselves because they still totally ignorant about what's going on in their new society. The schools, I'm always there asking about their behaves, and here I am. I'm just a woman. I'd be lucky, but what about the others who have no language? Single mother with 3 or 4 children, having no language, she have to deal with all these things in one time. She have to have work. She have to study English. watch out over her children and focus in her life. And she's just been traumatized and sent from a country she's been as a refugee there for 2 or 3 years, nobody knows. How can we deal with this situation immediately? It's still difficult, and I think Dr. Ed, he will give us a better idea about the services here in Illinois and what kind of difficulties we are normally have it. But the thing, I'm there in the street. The thing that make my work available for much of the people, I never attend an office, sit down after a desk, behind a desk, sorry, and make a report. I'm between the people. Every day I have 3 or 4 cases. The people, I know their stories, family with the names. If I get the names, just who's this family, I will tell you their stories immediately. I saw their life. I saw their life when they was in Iraq, when they was a refugee, and then when they be resettled here. Now I'm trying my best to have my life with my children in our new country. Hopefully that we will make it here. Thank you very much.